Okay, we can begin.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time this morning to join our webinar about the proposed tax cut for the cannabis industry and its potential impact on children and youth in California. I'm Jim Keddy. I'm the director of Youth Forward. Youth Forward is a nonprofit organization based in Sacramento. We've been working on cannabis policy since 2018. We initially did a bunch of work on records expungement, legislation that had to do with doing some automatic records expungement for people with past marijuana convictions. If you've been following the news, you'll be aware that unfortunately there's still some work to be done in that space because some counties are dragging their feet and clearing people's past records, something that we're paying attention to and trying to figure out how do we come back around to. And then we've also put a lot of time and energy into looking at cannabis revenue, and we've had the goal of steering that revenue from legal cannabis to children and youth services and to prevention in communities of color that were most impacted by the war on drugs. So in that part of our mission, we've done a bunch of work with state agencies and with the governor's office to help develop the Prop 64 grant programs. We do not receive any funding via Prop 64 or those grant programs, nor do we receive any funding from the cannabis industry. Joining me today, I'm very happy to say we have with us Keisha Nzewe. Keisha is the Director of Public Policy for the California Child Care Resource and Referral Network. She will be speaking in a little bit here on the impact of these proposed tax cuts on childcare, a huge issue, a huge concern. Also joining us is my colleague, Sarah Michael Gaston. Sarah Michael is currently an MPH student at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore and has done a bunch of work with Youth Forward on Prop 64 and will be returning to join our team this summer, which we're thrilled about. And then you've also likely seen the name Ajua Achianu, another member of my team, and Ajua would typically be managing this webinar and speaking to you all, but she is unfortunately ill. So she's not able to join us. So that's just a little bit about who we are, why we care about this issue. And we are recording this webinar. It will be placed on the Youth Forward YouTube channel. We will send you all a link to that. We'll also send out the slides. And certainly Ajua and I are available to you following the webinar to answer any questions. As we go through the webinar, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat function and we'll try to do some Q&A at the end. Okay. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, just by way of background, in 2016, we approved Prop 64, which legalized cannabis in California. Prop 64 established state tax rates on cannabis. And at the same time, Prop 64 gave the authority to local governments to permit legal businesses or to ban legal businesses. Local governments also have the authority to put in place their own taxes, a local tax on cannabis, and most cities and counties have done so. Today, we're just going to be focusing on state policy. There's a whole nother conversation to be had about what's happening at the local level with cannabis and public health and taxes. And then during the Prop 64 campaign, the proponents of the campaign promised voters that cannabis revenues would be allocated to child and youth services. So next slide. So in state law, there are currently 3 taxes in place on cannabis. There is the regular state sales tax, which I believe is at 7.5%. There's a 15% excise tax on top of that sales tax. So if you walk into dispensary and buy a cannabis product, you are paying for an additional sales tax. That's what the word excise tax refers to. And then, okay, sorry. And then there's also a cultivation tax, so a tax on folks who grow cannabis. And then again, based on what was written into Prop 64, these revenues go towards these different functions. So first of all, the revenues fund the state regulatory function, now called the Department of Cannabis Control. The taxes fund medical research, both on medical cannabis as well as recreational cannabis. There's funding that goes to the California Highway Patrol to develop a way to deal with driving while high. There's funding that goes to the Community Reinvestment Tax Program. This is a program managed by the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And then after those initial functions are supported by the tax revenue, then all the revenue flows into what was called in Prop 64, the Marijuana Tax Fund. And in the Marijuana Tax Fund, 60% goes to youth services, 20% to environmental restoration, 20% to public safety, public health, and youth prevention. So we're going to break that down for you as we go through the presentation today. Okay, next slide. So in December of this year, the cannabis industry put forward a proposal to the governor and to legislative leaders to make some big significant changes in how they are taxed. And they have put forward the notion of eliminating the cultivation tax entirely. The cultivation tax makes up about 20% of the revenue that flows to the state from cannabis. They've proposed suspending the excise tax for 3 years. That's where 80% of the revenue comes from. And then they've also asked the legislature to force cities in which voters approved Prop 64 to allow for legal businesses. This is a big concern for the cannabis industry, the fact that far fewer cities and counties allow for legal businesses than what people had initially anticipated. And the industry is making the argument that in order to compete against the illegal market, they need fewer taxes, less bureaucracy, and more cities and counties with legal businesses. And to make these changes, the legislature will need to pass a 2/3 vote bill. So this, there's going to be a process now over the next several months in which there will be a debate over these ideas in the legislature, and the legislature ultimately will need to send a bill to the governor. So what I'm going to do is just take a little minute here and find the link to the cannabis industry proposal, and I will put that in the chat for you so you can all see it directly and not have to just rely on me. So if you look in the chat from me, I just put in the link where you can see the online petition the cannabis industry used to put these ideas together and send them to the governor. I also want to stress that this is not the first time that the industry has tried to lower its tax rates. It's tried in 2 other occasions in past years through legislation, and both of those attempts were unsuccessful. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so a couple of just observations about what we're seeing. First of all, we want to recognize that the cannabis policy is complex, messy, and evolving. A lot of different competing interests, a lot of people making claims about what's going on. There's the issue of medical versus recreational cannabis. There are, of course, a lot of folks in California who use medical cannabis and are looking to have greater access to medical cannabis. There's issues around big business versus small business. And, as we see typically in capitalism, the big fish tend to get bigger and eat the small fish. There's issues in law about state versus federal. Federal government still considers cannabis to be an illegal drug. And then in some cities in California, we have emerging social equity efforts in which entrepreneurs of color are working to get a foothold in the industry and to benefit from this new wealth creation. This is, of course, super important because when we look at the war on drugs and the damage it did over many decades to Black and brown communities, now we all have all this new wealth being created that is primarily going to white people and big business. Another observation is if we see these taxes reduced or eliminated, it is going to be very difficult to have them reinstated in the future. I've worked on tobacco policy since the mid-1990s. We've never seen the legislature pass a tobacco tax of any size. Early on in the work on tobacco, the legislature passed a very, I think it was a 5-cent tax or something like that. The legislature's never had the political will to pass a meaningful tobacco tax. And that's, of course, because the tobacco industry spreads money around in the legislature and essentially buys off legislators. And we're seeing the cannabis industry grow that kind of clout and that kind of influence. So if we lose where we're at now, it's going to be hard to get it back. We go to the next slide. So this is just from this year's state budget. These are just the dollars that flow to youth services and that 60% set aside I referenced earlier. So just to go through these quickly, all of this money goes to the Department of Healthcare Service, which then does allocations to other agencies. So child care is receiving about $279 million in this state budget. Youth prevention with both the Department of Healthcare Services and Natural Resources Agency, that's about $93 million. And then the Department of Public Health is receiving $12 million. So that's a total of $385 million going back out to local communities, particularly to lower income communities and to communities of color. Next slide, please. All right, now I'd like to turn this over to Keisha and thank her again for joining us.
No problem. Good morning, everyone. My name is Keisha Nzewi, and as I was introduced at the top of the webinar, I am the Director of Public Policy for the California Child Care Resource and Referral Network. And in short, I'm just a child care advocate. So we can go to the next slide. A couple of years ago in the governor's budget, it was a surprise to everyone, I believe, including everyone on this call, that when he proposed that much of the funding that would go towards youth prevention would go towards childcare. And that was, for childcare advocates, a really pleasant surprise because it meant for the first time ever, there would be a regular source of funding for childcare and to support people who need help paying for childcare. So what that has meant is in this fiscal year, it's enough revenue to pay for over 21,000 children to be in the childcare that they know and love. So that regular source of funding, I wanted to say 21,000 in a state that's huge. And if you look at the bottom of the slide, in a state where there's more than 2 million children eligible for support subsidies in childcare, that 21,000 seems like a really small number, but that is a huge number because for year after year after year, we may have gotten 500 new childcare subsidies or maybe 5,000. But for the first time, we were seeing 5-digit levels and of something that would be continuous. So that's where the importance of this is from. Also well, I've actually said everything on this slide without reading it, but I just want you to know that to emphasize the last point is that while over 2 million children are eligible, we serve such a small number who are, and parents figure out, obviously, if you're a parent, you know how you figure out a way. Our children aren't just sitting, babies aren't alone, but money always helps to be able to pay for the childcare you know and love. So that's why this revenue is really, really important. Next slide. So the impact to childcare would be tremendous, that it would result in families losing access to affordable care. And we're seeing that now, even just through COVID, not necessarily because they've lost their subsidy, but because we're losing childcare providers because of COVID. Businesses are closing or they've had to have temporary closures. But that you combine that with possibly losing your means of paying for childcare, and it would really be devastating and extremely devastating for the children, the families, and the childcare providers who care for those children. And so losing this tax, losing 80% and 20%, which equals 100%, would mean a complete loss of our only long-term revenue stream that supports childcare in this state. And that would also prevent, as we linking it back to COVID, and if you listen to the governor's budget proposals last week or the week before, he very much emphasized recovery, pandemic recovery and pandemic support. But what was left out of all of that was childcare. But what was in there was helping people get back in the workforce. And we always point out people can't get back. Well, I hate using the word back, but can't leave the house to go to work when they have children to be cared for without childcare. So that's why this is really important to the childcare field. Next slide. I think that's it for me.
So now I'll talk about how the tax cut would affect youth prevention. There are a few grant programs that this severely impacts. First is the Youth Substance Use Disorder Prevention Program, which is called Elevate Youth California. It's run by the Department of Healthcare Services. And currently they've made Prop 64 grants to 137 organizations to provide youth prevention services in Black and Brown neighborhoods. They've gone to 41 counties, and there's been a total of 108 million to date. DHCS also has made about 8 million in youth prevention grants to 12 tribal communities. And this grant program focuses on providing substance use disorder prevention through youth activism, mentoring, and peer supports. Then there is the Youth Community Access Grant Program run by the California Natural Resources Agency, and they're preparing to release their first round of grants this month to support youth access to the outdoors and to cultural resources for disadvantaged children and youth in the total amount of 14.5 million. And that we were kind of surprised with it going to the Natural Resources Agency and just looking at outdoor environmental resources as a way to provide youth prevention, but there are a lot of health benefits to young people being outdoors and learning about the native history of the land that they're on, and it being a healing experience for them, and all the things that they're going through. So that was a really innovative grant program, and the grant fund is going to continue to grow. There are two more funding streams for youth services. In addition to the 60% of funds dedicated to youth services in the marijuana tax fund, there is the Community Reinvestment Grants Program managed by GoBiz, which was what Jim was saying. And that predominantly goes to Black and Brown communities, people impacted by the war on drugs, and to serve. And so that can include young people, but it also can include families and adults. And that is for job training, mental health services, system navigation, stuff like that. And then there's the Prop 64 Public Health and Safety Grant Program managed by the Board of State and Community Corrections. And I'll go into a little more detail. The GoBiz has awarded Prop 64 grants to community organizations and local health departments to provide services to the formerly incarcerated and to youth and adults in communities impacted by the war on drugs, like I said. And according to the grant reports from September 2019 to July 2021, the grant program has provided services to more than 57,000 individuals across the state. And I know from talking to the grant administrators that period encompasses some of the pandemic, and the grantees had to kind of pivot and provide services that kind of affected the families and the people that they served because of the pandemic. And they showed some flexibility with that, where the money was going. So I know that was really helpful for all the recipients and all the organizations that were doing work for this grant program. The Board and State and Community Corrections Grant Program, they've made 33 million in Prop 64 grants to 33 local governments to support youth prevention, public health, and public safety. These funds are part of the 20% set aside for public safety, and to date, 40% of the funded projects are focused on youth prevention, while the other 60% focuses on a mix of youth services, public safety, and public health. And then the BSCC is preparing to make an additional 120 million in grants to local governments in the coming months. And so that this program looks like kind of some law enforcement is involved in working with community-based organizations to provide prevention efforts, like violence prevention, like efforts to we tried to make it focused on people impacted by the war on drugs, so Black and Brown and tribal communities impacted. And so what's the impact of this tax cut on youth prevention services? Well, it's a loss of roughly 200 million in funding for youth services to these communities of color. And as we know, as most people know, they're always trying to de-invest in our young people and the services that they need to thrive. And so this is a loss to a long-term revenue stream for youth services if they do reduce the tax or eliminate the tax. So it would be, and I think as Keisha was saying about COVID affecting the childcare, people that are receiving childcare, the like after school programs or the mentoring programs that some of these grants are funding, it would make it really difficult for these families if they don't have a place for their young person to go and get support and be occupied.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Sarah, I realized earlier on, I think we skipped one of the observation slides. So if you don't mind, if we could flip back to that.
Yeah, most definitely. I think it went through it. The clicking of this is not working in the way that it's supposed to. Okay.
Okay, that's that second. It's that one right there. The one after it. Oh no, this is the one.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think one thing I missed when I was talking about this earlier is that as we look at what's happening with young people and with cannabis big picture, I did want to lift up that the industry is becoming more and more corporatized, and it's using sophisticated marketing and advertising methods to attract users, including young people. So for example, here in the city of Sacramento, we have cannabis billboards that are clearly marketing to youth. We've had a cannabis billboard where the local business spells out its name in sour gummy worms. We have cannabis billboards that feature young models who could be anywhere from their late teens to their early 20s, promising you that you'll feel better if you use cannabis. These are the kinds of marketing strategies we used to see with tobacco. We've seen off and on over the years with alcohol. The other concern I wanted to lift up is the increase in THC levels that we've seen as cannabis has become over the years, and that the risk this is posing to youth mental health. There's this growing body of research in both the United States and in Europe about how THC can trigger paranoia, delusion, psychosis with young people. So we're all going to be having, I think, more and more of a conversation about various issues in cannabis, all of us who work on youth and its impact. And then another trend just to lift up is the growing number of pregnant women using cannabis and the impact of cannabis use on newborns and birth weight, a lot of critical issues. So I'm seeing some stuff here in the chat about people not hearing me. Can other folks hear me? I know someone's having trouble hearing me. I apologize for that. Okay. Sarah, can we go to the next slide? Okay, here's the other point I wanted to catch. So what the industry is proposing is an across-the-board tax cut. This is not a targeted tax cut. You know, if this were a tax cut targeted to the social equity programs, I think we'd be having a different conversation about it, because that would kind of fit in with our larger goal of reinvestment in communities impacted by the war on drugs. This is an across-the-board tax cut that will definitely benefit the big fish in the industry. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, what you see always is big fish eating the little fish. So that's what's going to be going on. So yeah, I think I missed that point in my last one. All right, let's go back down to the last slide. Okay, so what can we do about this? So we want to urge you to contact your assembly members and your state senator to let them know about concerns you have. This is an issue that has not been on the radar screen of legislators. The only way it gets on the the radar screen is if folks in the local community share their concerns. So if you've benefited from Prop 64 grant, please consider contacting your local legislators. Also consider contacting your local officials about the impact of the proposed tax cut on childcare and youth services in your local community. It's important that they understand how your community would be impacted, so that they're able to also communicate with the legislature. You know, here in the Sacramento area, we've had nonprofits receive about $20 million through the GoBiz grant program or through Elevate Youth California. Our city received $1 million grant from the Board of State and Community Corrections, which it's investing in youth prevention. So I think that's all important. And then finally, super important to share your concerns on social media. And then next slide. And then finally, we've put together a letter to the governor and to the legislative leaders, which I'll put in the chat.
Can you see it?
Yeah, I just put the letter in the chat. This is a letter to the governor and to legislative leaders. And what we're asking is, if you're an organization who shares this concern, please add your organization to this letter. We're going to give this until February 4th to collect names of organizations and your logos, your title, etc. And then we will share that letter with the legislature and with the governor. We'll also do some media work on the legislature, media work on the letter, I should say, so that we start to get into stories around the state about the impact of the proposed cuts on child and youth services. And to date, there has been a lot of coverage of the push from the cannabis industry to do a tax cut, and very little mention, if actually no mention, of the potential impact on childcare and youth and prevention services. So yeah, so with that, let me just ask if Keisha has anything she'd like to add to what we've covered so far. If there are any other observations you'd like to make, Keisha, as we've gone through this material.
I only have an observation based on some of the questions in chat, and that's that the governor, in his press conference for the budget a couple weeks ago, received a question around the cannabis industry proposal, and what would he do for all the things that this funds. And he did acknowledge in that they would need to if they were to move forward with the current proposals, that they would need to figure out a way to continue to fund the services that would lose the funding, which is good that he recognized that on the fly. It's bad in that we would need a commitment to regular, ongoing, dependable funding, not like one-time fixes for this year or whatnot. it needs to be as ongoing as the loss of revenue is. So that's all I would add.
Yeah, thanks, Keisha, for lifting that up. That was something I wanted to mention as well. So we could be in a scenario this year, I think this was mentioned in the chat, where the legislature does the tax cut for the cannabis industry, and then it uses general fund dollars to backfill the child care and youth prevention services. So that's a possible scenario. The downside to that scenario is that if the economy slows and we end up with a state budget that's in deficit, our access to doing the backfill from the general fund, that's, who knows what would happen there. When voters approved Prop 64, we were approving a long-term revenue stream for child and youth services and voting for that initiative. And if we remove the tax stream, who knows what happens with childcare, who knows what happens with these services. We're kind of in the usual situation of the year-to-year budget battle. And I think all of us who work on kids issues, it's clear to us that when you look at the year-to-year budget battle, low-income kids and kids of color, we typically don't fare that well. So, which is why California has one of the highest child poverty rates in the country, and has a very weak and fragmented infrastructure when it comes to childcare and to youth prevention. All right, let's go through and just see if we can take a few more questions in the chat. And let me just also state, you're hearing us advocate on kids issues here. I know there are folks in the chat from the social equity programs and have a point of view which I completely respect, and that all needs to be part of this dialogue that's going to evolve over the next months. So. All right. There's a question in the chat about actual legislation. As far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, there's not legislation in print yet. I know there are people working behind the scenes with different legislators on these bills, and there may be, I think there was a comment earlier in the chat that the McGuire bill on cultivation would be revenue neutral. So that would, I imagine, would be this kind of backfill idea we've talked about. There's also been a comment from Amber about this idea that if we grow a larger legal cannabis industry, that legal industry will generate more tax revenue over the long run, which is true. It's true. Yeah.
But their proposal is no taxes.
Yeah, Terry, my friend Terry up north is wondering if is that Senator Mike McGuire? Yes, Senator Mike McGuire has been quoted in the press on that he would carry the bill to eliminate the cultivation tax. Okay. Sarah, do you see any other questions we should be responding to? We're going to wrap up here in a few minutes, and we'll share our contact information so we can have other dialogue back and forth.
I'm going to stop share. It's hard to navigate both the chat with that.
Yeah, a lot going on in here.
But I feel like there's several good ones in the chat.
Yeah, let me just take one question I see here. So there's so when it comes to local cities and counties that have cannabis taxes in place, it says there's a question here about do they have any? Was there anything in Prop 64 that requires them to invest those dollars from a racial and social equity point of view? And unfortunately, the answer to that is no. Local cities and counties can do whatever they want with their cannabis revenue. We did an analysis of that last year. You'll find it on the Youth Forward resource page. And you'll see that in our analysis, it's clear that cities and counties are generally spending their local cannabis revenue on their general fund and on law enforcement, which in our view is very problematic. There's some debate here in the Q&A about is in fact is the cannabis industry really struggling? I think that's definitely a point of debate. Any other one question there? Certainly, if you're currently a recipient of a Prop 64 grant, would your grant be impacted by a cut? I believe the answer to that question is no, but we will follow up with the state agencies just to confirm that.
And then Jim, some people are wondering what's the legislative timeframe for submitting letters on this matter, and then specifically for the bills, how soon could it take effect if passed?
Yeah, so you'll be getting more information from us. We'll be tracking this and sending you emails so you'll know what's going on. But I would encourage everyone to act now. And in terms of this letter that we're circulating, we would really appreciate it if you could share that letter with other organizations in your community that care about childcare, care about youth services. The more this letter gets circulated, the more impact it will have. And the more just circulating the awareness by itself raises awareness, because this is going to be, in my view, a long-term struggle as we look at, how is cannabis taxed? How does it impact kids? How does the industry become more equitable? These are all issues we're all going to be grappling with. So I put the link to the letter in the chat again.
I think there was a comment saying that you can't copy and paste from the chat, so we'll just send it out in the listserv, like when we send a follow-up. And we'll also email the presentation info, the slides, the recording, all of what we've shared here today. You will be seeing in your email inbox.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We want to thank everyone again for joining. And let's show the last slide with our contact information, sir. I think, did we skip that one?
I can share it now. It's the last one.
All right, so there is our contact information. We'll just leave it up here for a couple of minutes as people sign off.
Sorry, I did not
All
know
right.
that.
No, are we good to go?
Yeah, I think we're good to go.